New videos every day. Psychetruth. Life, wisdom. Today I'm going to answer that age-old question, what the f*** is really in a Big Mac? When you think about a hamburger, you think about a couple core ingredients. Hamburger bun, hamburger patty, lettuce, tomatoes, pickles. How many ingredients do you think are contained in a Big Mac? So in this video, I'm going to reveal exactly what is inside of a Big Mac, but I want you to leave your guess and let me know how many ingredients do you think it is. So whoever can answer the closest is going to win a free month of access to our exclusive patrons-only website filled with exclusive content. So normally when you buy a food, it has an ingredient label. They're actually required to print an ingredient label on the food. But when you get food from a restaurant or a fast food restaurant, you'll notice that they do not include any such ingredient list. There is a little bit of nutritional info on the back, but there is no ingredient list. So I'm just venturing a guess, but I think that this is the reason why. Okay, so this is just a printed list of the ingredients. You can see there are quite a few of them. And this is obviously why they don't have the ingredient label printed on the box. Now, I could easily go on for a really long time talking about what each and every one of these chemicals are, but I'm gonna try to get through them as quickly as possible. Now, I literally did sit down and look up every single one of these ingredients, and I have to tell you, I was shocked. I kept thinking, okay, this one can't be that bad. And then I would read it and wow, it's way worse than I had ever even imagined. So you kind of have to be a chemistry major or a chemist to actually understand what a lot of these things are, but I'm gonna do my very best to explain them to you. So let's dive right in. The very first ingredient, we're gonna start with the bun, which is the order that they go in on their website. The first ingredient is enriched bleached flour. So enriched flour is a perfect example of a highly processed partial food because literally they've taken just part of a grain of wheat to use to create this flour. So the first part of processing involves removing the bran and the germ from the grain of wheat, leaving just the endosperm. So basically they remove the fiber, they remove a lot of the B vitamins, a lot of the minerals, and what's left is the really high carbohydrate part. Now there are a couple of nutrients that will still remain in it, but what you need to understand is literally they've taken away 2 parts of the grain and they're making this flour out of just 1 part of the grain. So we're starting with just part of the grain, the endosperm, which is gonna get ground up into flour and then bleached. Now, I won't even bleach my hair, much less eat something that's been bleached. The bleaching process is actually banned in a few different countries. So just these first 2 steps of separating a certain part of the grain that we're gonna use for the flour and then bleaching it, already we've created a really highly processed partial food, what I would call a frankenfood, that immediately I would avoid. Another concern about bleaching flour is a byproduct that is kind of inadvertently created by the process of bleaching. Now it's called alloxan. And alloxan is a chemical that they use to create diabetes in healthy mice so that they can use them in laboratory studies for diabetic medications. So literally this byproduct of the bleaching process is known to cause diabetes in lab rats, is actually used to cause diabetes in lab rats. So while this is not actually an added ingredient, it's a byprocess or a byproduct of the bleaching process. But it's enriched, you say? Well, let's talk a little bit about this enriched and enriching process that is in this enriched bread. So back in the 1920s, they started to observe that the white processed flour that had become very popular because it had an extended shelf life was actually causing digestive issues, was potentially causing illness. So they decided to add back in some of the nutrients that are lost in the processing. And what you'll see is that it's actually quite a few different nutrients that are lost and then added back in. But these nutrients that are added back in are often synthetic, right? Nothing can compare to getting those nutrients from a minimally processed grain the way it is when it comes out of the ground. Unfortunately, this enriched flour bun is nothing like the happy little wheat grain that it used to be. So the bun alone is a big turnoff for me. Continuing down our bun ingredients, we have water. We also have, as the third ingredient, high fructose corn syrup and/or sugar. Now, both of these ingredients have a pretty long list of offenses. The first one is that they are likely genetically modified, or they're GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Most of the corn and most of the sugar beets in the United States are genetically modified. And because here in the States we don't label foods that contain GMOs, we have no way of knowing whether or not something is GMO or not. So the best guess would be that if it's a conventional crop, a non-organic crop, and it's one of the crops that are genetically modified in large amounts, then chances are good, that it actually does contain GMO. So that would apply both to the sugar and the high fructose corn syrup. Both of these are highly refined and highly processed chemicals. So this means they're gonna spike up your blood sugar, contributing to blood sugar regulation issues, contributing to diabetes. High fructose corn syrup has also been found to have potential traces of mercury in it, right? And other contaminations that just result from the processing of these highly processed sweeteners. So moving on down the list, we have yeast, which actually is a regular ingredient in most bakery goods. And then we have soybean and/or canola oil. Now, these are highly processed oils. These are what we would consider the bad fats, fats that are going to contribute to heart disease and are not going to contribute to our overall health. Furthermore, canola and soy are also among the top genetically modified crops in the United States. So even though we don't know for a fact that this soybean oil and canola oil is genetically modified, chances are really good that they are. So next up, we have the little section that says contains 2% or less of, and then this pretty long list of chemicals. And what I want to tell you before we embark on this list and actually talk about what these chemicals are, is that the only reason that it says contains 2% or less of these chemicals is because the FDA requires that these chemicals are not present at any higher than this percentage. So what that implies is that there are some safety concerns or potential safety concerns for all of these chemicals. Because if there weren't any safety concern, the FDA wouldn't require this really strict limitation at 2% or less. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of these chemicals. First, we have salt, which is not necessarily good for us, but at least we actually know what salt is. Next up, we have wheat gluten. Here again is an instance of what I would consider a partial food, right? They're just taking one part of that grain of wheat and isolating it to turn it into a food ingredient. And it could be synthetic, it could be sourced in all kinds of different ways. And then we have calcium sulfate. Now this is a mineral sourced from gypsum, and gypsum is a source for many different chemicals, lots of them very popular, fertilizers, also the primary ingredient in plaster of Paris and other plasters, also ingredient in everything from foot creams and shampoos to the bun of your Big Mac. A similar chemical is calcium carbonate, which is also sourced from rocks, and ammonium sulfate, which is a byproduct of the steel-making industry. It's basically made by treating ammonia with sulfuric acid. Now, the ammonia that they use also has an interesting origin, and that is most often what they call coke ovens. But it's not the kind of coke you're thinking of. This coke is a type of fuel that is derived from coal. So these coke ovens are literally turning coal into fuel. They create a lot of ammonia, and then that ammonia can be used to put in your Big Mac bun. And then there's ammonium chloride, which is also a byproduct of burning coal dumps. Ammonium chloride is also used in many fertilizers. It's used as an expectorant in cough syrup, and it is also used to help add texture and flavor to many bread and bakery products. And then we have a whole list of dough conditioners, which are really just added to improve the condition of the dough. So the first one is sodium stearoyl lactylate. According to the Food Chemical Codex 7th edition, SSL is currently manufactured by the esterification of stearic acid with lactic acid and partially neutralized with either food-grade soda ash or caustic soda. And what I want you to take from this is that this food additive is made in a lab. It's made by scientists, it's made by chemists, it's not made by chefs, and it's not even made in a kitchen. And then there's DATEM. Now, immediately, this guy kind of sets off my red flag because in general, I know that when you see an acronym on an ingredient label, like EDTA, TBHQ, BHT, usually this really nice sounding acronym just stands for some really ridiculously long chemical name. And it turns out I was right. So this diacetyl tartaric acid ester of mono and diglycerides, or DATEM, is just one of many dough conditioner food additives that are what they call generally recognized as safe by the FDA, despite the fact that there hasn't really been any extensive safety research on this chemical. Now, what I found especially frightening about this diacetyl tartaric acid ester of mono and diglycerides, DATEM, is that when you go to its Wikipedia page, it literally tells you that the method of creating this chemical is not well understood. Now, normally when you go to the Wikipedia page of most of these chemicals, you're gonna see a really long chemical mumbo-jumbo explanation of how they make it. So for the sodium stearoyl lactylate, all of these different chemicals I've discussed, you can see a very detailed chemical discussion of exactly how the chemical is made and the different safety research that's been done on it. But this DATEM, literally the Wikipedia page is pretty much blank. So at this point in my researching the Big Mac, I was already feeling pretty overwhelmed, and I was kind of thinking, okay, not every single ingredient can really be that bad, come on. So the next one is ascorbic acid. And I'd always just thought, oh, ascorbic acid, it's synthetic vitamin C, big whoop, can't be that bad for you. But after learning a little bit more about how they make ascorbic acid, I'm not so sure. Ascorbic acid is prepared from glucose in a method based on the Reichstein process. In the first of a 5-step process, glucose is catalytically hydrogenated to sorbitol, which is then oxidized by the microorganism Acetobacter suboxidans to sorbose. At this point, there are a few options: treatment of the product with acetone, the chemical that they use to make nail polish remover, oxidation via a bleaching solution, or a genetically modified microbe species such as the mutant Erwinia, among others, which oxidizes sorbose into 2-ketogluconic acid, which can then undergo ring-closing lactonization via dehydration. Now, the reason that I read off that little chemical description to you is just to illustrate what a crazy chemical concoction this stuff actually is. And probably the most horrific thing to me is that they actually use a genetically modified bacteria to carry out part of this chemical process. And actually, one of the sources that I found noted that American and Chinese companies are currently competing to genetically modify, to genetically create yet another species of bacteria that can do this process even more efficiently. Talk about something that is highly processed, not natural, and just gross. Azodicarbonamide, the yoga mat chemical. Yes, indeed, the chemical that has gotten a lot of flack lately, and that Subway actually vowed to remove from their products. Azodicarbonamide is banned in Europe, Singapore, and Australia, but here in the United States, it's generally recognized as safe by the FDA. And despite the fact that it is completely safe, Subway and a few other companies have chosen to remove it from their products due to concern. So actually, Food Babe put out a petition, and I think it has 75,000 signatures of people petitioning to remove the yoga mat chemical from their products. Now, what's interesting is to actually look at a quick list of all of the other fast food restaurants which are also using this chemical. McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, Jack in the Box, Arby's, Chick-fil-A, Dunkin' Donuts, Starbucks, and several others all have azodicarbonamide used in some of their products. But what's so bad about the yoga mat chemical anyway? Well, other than the fact that they also use this chemical in yoga mats, azodicarbonamide has been linked to asthma and allergies due to exposure. Usually this is by people who are exposed in a workplace setting to large amounts of azodicarbonamide. Also, there are byproducts like urethane and what they call semi-carbazide, which, one of which is a known carcinogen and the other has been shown to be potentially carcinogenic. Now, defenders of azodicarbonamide will point out that the studies in which it was linked to asthma and allergies were primarily done on workers who were exposed to large amounts of the chemical, inhaling it, right, rather than digesting it in small amounts. But when we're talking about any kind of chemical, we have to consider accumulated exposure. And what I mean by that is how much exposure do we accumulate over time? Now, there's actually a list of over 500 different products that contain azodicarbonamide, and I just gave you that list of all the fast food restaurants that use it. So what I pose to you is that if we are taking in even really tiny amounts of a chemical over and over and over again, how do they have any way of actually knowing what our accumulated or total exposure to that chemical is? Next up, we have mono and diglycerides, a seemingly innocent food additive. Something I've seen on probably 100 food labels and always just thought, oh, well, it can't be that bad. Well, upon further investigation, they are. Mono and diglycerides are a food additive used as an emulsifier, and basically that just means that they're used to help combine fat and water, which normally don't combine very well. So they're a type of fatty acid, but what's really scary about mono and diglycerides is that the processing methods used to make them are never disclosed. So when you see mono and diglycerides on a label, these can actually be partially hydrogenated trans fats, but you won't see partially hydrogenated oils on the label, and you won't see, the trans fat that they account for anywhere in the listing of the nutrition facts. And that's because that requirement to list trans fat content only corresponds or only applies to actual ingredients. It doesn't apply to food additives. So mono and diglycerides are a really clever way, sneaky, evil way that they can include partially hydrogenated trans fats, which are the absolute worst kind of fat for you, and get around having to label it or even mention that that food contains trans fats. Ethoxylated monoglycerides. I'll just say this, they don't get any healthier once you ethoxylate them, okay? These are still potential sources of trans fats and still something that you definitely want to avoid. So at this point, you're probably wondering, man, if I wanted to make my own Big Mac, where on earth would I find all the ingredients? Because they don't sell ethoxylated monoglycerides at the grocery store, okay? Bottom line here is this is a highly processed chemical frankenfood, and we're not even through all the ingredients yet. Monocalcium phosphate. Now this little baby is extracted from phosphoric acid, which is a synthetic chemical that they basically derive from rocks. And I talked more specifically about phosphoric acid in my video on the acidity of sodas. So monocalcium phosphate is another one of these multi-use chemicals used in the fertilizer industry, used in industry, agriculture, and also used to condition the dough of your bread. Enzymes. Another seemingly innocent ingredient that normally I would have just looked over, except in this video, I was determined to actually look into every single one of the Big Mac ingredients. And guess what I found? From the FDA's website, listing the different enzyme preparations which can be used in foods, here are just a few of the excerpts that I found especially jaw-dropping. Catalase from bovine liver. Animal lipase derived from the edible forestomach of calves, kids, or lambs. Pepsin from hog stomach. Ripsin from bovine pancreas. And this was just, as I said, a mere snapshot of literally hundreds of different enzyme preparations that were listed. And again, many of them are prepared actually from different strains of bacteria and fungus and all kinds of weird stuff I couldn't pronounce, so I decided not to. The bottom line is that enzymes are good for you. Enzymes are naturally present in every natural normal food that we eat. But when we are looking at them on a food additive, right, when we're seeing them on an ingredient label, the big question is, how do they get it? What do they extract it from? And that, when you start asking that question, actually start looking, can be pretty freaking appalling. Guar gum. Now, guar gum is a very common food additive. It's used as a filler, right? So basically just to take up space. But guar gum has actually been banned by the FDA in certain amounts. So it's one of those chemicals that can only be used at a very, very, very low amount, because at large amounts it's been found to obstruct the esophagus and intestines, which you can imagine would be really, really uncomfortable. So guar gum, it's gonna be a food additive that I'm really gonna try to avoid. Calcium peroxide is another synthetic chemical with a myriad of uses in industry, agriculture, and in the bun of your Big Mac. It is used to help keep it white. Sorbic acid is yet another synthetic preservative, but this one actually has been found to be an irritant. And in high enough quantities, it can be an irritant to the eyes, the skin, and the respiratory tract. So maybe none of those things sound like they could be a danger, although I am touching this right now. Hopefully it's not going to be an irritant to my skin. But even though you're not necessarily putting the Big Mac in your eye, something that's a chemical irritant to any part of the body is not something I would want to be ingesting. So it's not surprising that as we get towards the end of the list, actually I think the chemicals are getting worse. So now we're on to calcium and or sodium propionate. Now these are preservatives, and these preservatives actually have been linked to permanent damage of the stomach lining by what they call gastritis, which is basically just inflammation of the stomach lining. These chemicals can also induce ulcers. In children, these chemicals have been found to cause hyperactivity, behavioral issues, irritability, and inability to focus. Now, luckily, these behavioral changes will resolve or get better after you stop consuming the calcium propionate or sodium propionate. But again, looking at the world we're living in and all of these problems that are becoming increasingly common in our society, when you see a food additive with potential side effects like that, you just kind of have to wonder, number one, why in the heck are they putting it in food at all? And number two, could this be contributing to problems that have really become quite rampant in our society? Soy lecithin. Now, this ingredient is incredibly common, right? We see soy lecithin almost everywhere. It has preservative properties. It also kind of serves somewhat as a filler. And soy, because it's subsidized by our government and because most of the soy is genetically modified or GMO, it's incredibly cheap. So that's one of the reasons that we see soy lecithin pretty much everywhere. And even though we don't know for a fact that it's genetically modified, chances are really good that it probably is, because most of the soy produced in this country is indeed genetically modified. So we have finally arrived at the very last ingredient, just in the bun. I don't know how long I've been talking, but I've been talking for a long time and I'm still talking about the freaking bun. So the last ingredient is the sesame seeds, and that was always my favorite ingredient of the Big Mac, back when I used to eat Big Macs. Now, I didn't do any extensive research on sesame seeds. Normally, sesame seeds would be a very healthful thing to consume. I would imagine the sesame seeds they use at McDonald's probably aren't the healthiest ones, but like I said, I'm gonna kind of give them the benefit of the doubt. I didn't dig up any dirt on the sesame seeds. We're just gonna hope that they're not too bad for you. So now we're finally ready to move on. We went through the bun, and now it's time to talk about this. It looks really small once you put it out, once you pull it out. So here is our patty, right? Here is our, what they are very proud to proclaim is a 100% all beef patty. But let's talk a little bit about what we're really eating when we eat this little patty here. The first consideration is that the meat you get from a fast food restaurant is arguably the lowest of the lowest quality meat you could find just about anywhere other than dog food, maybe. So when we talk about the problems with conventional meat products or factory farms, and this is something I've talked about a lot, right? Which is that most of the farms that are producing beef or pork or any of the different animal products that we consume, generally these animals are loaded up with a whole bunch of antibiotics and hormones so that they'll produce more meat or they'll produce more milk. They're fed an unnatural diet. Oftentimes they're kept in very tight quarters. Sometimes they're not even allowed to run around outside and frolic in the sunshine the way that animals are supposed to. So they're incredibly stressed out. They're sick. This is not a good, healthy animal, and it's not going to give you good, healthy meat. Beyond that, it's also highly, highly processed. So they take the meat from these really probably sickly animals, and then they process it. They grind it all up, they reconstitute it. Who even knows what they do with it, because they don't have to tell you. If it's a processing method, they don't have to tell you what it is, and they don't even have to tell you what kind of chemicals they use in the processing. Okay, so highly processed, very low quality meat. I think that in general, most of the fast food meat patties are about 50% fat. So you couldn't even buy meat this fatty at a grocery store, okay? You need to understand that even though you can't really see the fat, it doesn't look like it's in there, this little baby is way more fat than you would ever probably consume on purpose. So moving right along. Next up, and I don't know how I'm gonna show this, but I guess y'all can see this, right? Ooh. We got the sauce. We got the Big Mac sauce. Okay, now, if I was gonna eat this Big Mac, and I'm not, I would be PO'd that this is how much Big Mac sauce I got. It doesn't even take up half of the middle-sized bun. Maybe there's more sauce. I don't see any more sauce anywhere else on it. Looks like this bottom is just cheese and meat. So, I mean, they jip. Not only that, but they're jipping you, right? That's a total jip. Let's talk about, though, what's in the sauce. So the first ingredient is soybean oil, and we already talked a lot about soybean oil, right? So it's highly processed, it's a bad fat, and it's probably sourced from genetically modified soybeans, so it's probably GMO. Next up, we have the pickle relish, which contains diced pickles, high fructose corn syrup, sugar, vinegar, corn syrup, salt, calcium chloride, xanthan gum, potassium sorbate, spice extractives, and polysorbate 80. So xanthan gum is a derivative from corn, so again, probably GMO. Talking about potassium sorbate, this is a preservative, but it actually is known to be a potential irritant. Again, a potential skin irritant. It's also known to be what they call mutagenic, which means causes mutations, which is a really important part of what causes cancer, right? Actually causing mutations to the DNA is one of the side effects of potassium sorbate. Now, polysorbate 80 is an emulsifier, but there actually are certain people who are allergic to polysorbate 80. So not everyone has allergic reactions to it, but a certain portion of the population will. It's also known to exacerbate Crohn's disease. Then we have distilled vinegar, water, egg yolks, our good old pal, high fructose corn syrup, onion powder, mustard seed, salt, spices, and propylene glycol alginate. Now, the propylene glycol alginate doesn't have a huge list of dangerous side effects associated with it, but the next ingredient, sodium benzoate, does. So sodium benzoate is an extremely common preservative. It is synthetically produced and very, very cheap to produce, which is why we see it so pervasively in so many products. Now, sodium benzoate has been linked to hyperactivity in children, especially when consumed in conjunction with artificial colors, which I guess we'll find out in a second whether or not our Big Mac contains artificial colors or not. And there is also, again, a byproduct of sodium benzoate, which is known to be a potential carcinogen, or is thought to be a potential carcinogen. So again, even though the sodium benzoate itself may not be carcinogenic, there's all different kinds of byproducts that can be formed when we actually consume these different chemicals, and those byproducts themselves, in many cases, actually are known to be carcinogenic. Sugar, garlic powder, and vegetable protein, hydrolyzed corn, soy, and wheat. Now, if you watched my Food Chemicals the Musical music video, then you learned that hydrolyzed vegetable protein is just another name for MSG. So, while you actually will not see monosodium glutamate, or MSG, Anywhere in these Big Mac ingredients, you will see hydrolyzed vegetable protein, and you can basically just consider that as code word for MSG. Caramel color, extractives of paprika, soy lecithin, turmeric, and calcium disodium EDTA, or calcium disodium ethylene diamine tetraacetic acid. EDTA is a flavor protector used in many different foods. This is a food chemical that I have talked about before, so I'm gonna go ahead and glaze over it, move on to the cheese. So once again, the cheese has way more ingredients than you would normally see in cheese. We've got milk, cream, water, cheese culture, sodium citrate, 2% or less of, salt, citric acid, sodium phosphate, sorbic acid, lactic acid, acetic acid, enzymes, sodium pyrophosphate, natural flavor, color added, and soy lecithin. So that color added, that's the artificial colors that we were looking for a second ago. Honestly, I didn't even look up all the chemicals in the cheese because honestly, if you're still watching this video, hopefully the take-home message has been delivered, which is that this Big Mac contains way more chemicals and way more crazy ingredients than anyone in their right mind should want to consume, okay? If we just took 3 or 4 of the different ingredients I've talked about today, it would be enough to deter me from wanting to eat something like this. But when you consider all of the different ingredients all combined into this one little package, you just have to realize that this is a chemical nightmare. This is a frankenfood, toxic, disgusting, toxic mess. And hopefully this video convinced you to not consume any more Big Macs. But if you love burgers, and even if you love Big Macs, all is not lost. In a future video, I'm gonna talk to you and explain to you how easy it would be to create your own healthy Big Mac. I'm gonna tell you how to eat a healthy hamburger. And in another video, I'm going to tell you what exactly is in Chicken McNuggets. And I think you'll be just as shocked as you were to see what was in the Big Mac. After watching this video, you may be thinking, geez, Corrina, what's left for me to eat? If that's the case, then check out my video, Basic Nutrition, What to Eat. If you're like most people, you've tried a dozen different diets and weight loss doodads trying to lose weight. But if you are looking for simple, easy, and cheap ways to lose weight, check out my video, 10 Easy Ways to Lose Weight. So maybe even after this discussion of Big Mac ingredients, you are still craving a Big Mac. If that's the case, check out my video discussing why fast food is addictive and how it's engineered to be that way.